Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations work past the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robby Russell. On this episode, we are joined by Avdi Grimm, who is a software developer, consultant, coach, speaker, and author of the books Confident Ruby and Exceptional Ruby. Avdi is also the creator and head gardener of Graceful Dev. Avdi joins us from St. Louis, Missouri. Or is it St. Louis, Missouri? I can never remember. Missouri. Avdi Grimm, welcome to Maintainable.
Thank you for having me.
So as you reflect on your time in the industry, what do you believe are a few characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
That's a really interesting question. I think more often about the characteristics of the teams maintaining them than the software itself, because I think that often makes or breaks it. Well-maintained software has a lot of attention paid to documentation. That's one thing that stands out, and that can take a lot of forms.
Such as, do you feel like there's a big distinction between where you document the code itself versus auxiliary documentation around things, README files, or?
So, yeah, there's so many places that we document our code, ranging from the not so effective, which is like, oh, that's only documented in a ticket somewhere that we worked on at some point, to documentation that you find in wikis, which also I've found over the years, I really wanted to believe in that one, but that one I think has been problematic because it's just, no matter what you do, it's out of sight and out of mind, and it tends to get out of date really fast. Nobody has, the impetus to work on it and keep it up to date. Then you have commits. You have the messages and commits, and I think those are really important. I think, especially, a lot of times we try to document decisions in comments, but that really belong in commit messages because they document our thinking at that time, as opposed to, the code may change out from under the comments around it. So that's an important one. Comments in the code are important as well for the why rather than the how. Lately, I've really been liking versioned documentation in the code base that's, kind of like a wiki, but it's really just markdown that's in the repo, just because you can version that right along with the code. You can update the code, and then you can update the documentation, and that goes with that version of the code, but not necessarily any versions that came before. And you can see, like, okay, this documentation hasn't been updated not nearly as recently as the code that it applies to, so maybe it's out of date. That's a good one. One of my favorite forms of documentation is executable documentation in various forms. And I view all of this as kind of a continuum of reproduction. From the README, which is like telling people how to reproduce something manually, and then you get into automations. You get into, like, for instance, in a Ruby or Rails project, you get rake tasks that document how to do something, and can often tell you, like, how to work with a particular service that we work with in the form of code that runs, or maybe at least ran at some point. I really like that kind of documentation.
I'm curious about that, like, rake task type of example there. Do you have like a recent example off the top of your head that kind of dig into a little bit?
So I've been working, for my site Graceful Dev, I've been working on this kind of recursive book, which is a book about project automation, and it documents the automation for the book. It's kind of a cycle. And it's a fun exercise in these kinds of things. And I was writing yesterday about a part where I wanted to do some writing to an external API as part of pushing the book to a learning management system, which meant that I first needed to figure out how this API worked and what kind of data models it used in a way that was more concrete than just like reading the documentation that it had. And so rather than play around with it at the command line in curl or play around with it from like Postman, I instead started writing an automation which all it would do is just pull down some info from this API, which wasn't ultimately what I needed to do. Ultimately, I needed to write something to the API, but to figure out how this API works, I started writing an automation that was just like fetch course info. I wrote a line and then I executed the rake task and I saw that that worked. And so I added another line to the rake task and I executed that. And if that broke, then I revisited it and figured out what I was doing wrong. And I just kept adding to this rake task and committing. And it's not a task that does something the project needs by itself, but it does document in an executable way how to interact with this API, how to set net HTTP up to talk to this API, how to do the authentication, and stuff like that. I'm really a big fan of that. Lately, I've also been really applying that a lot in the form of dev containers. So like every project that I work on has expectations about tools that are installed and libraries that are installed, dependencies, operating system versions, and stuff like that. And if I can create a container for development for that project, then that container definition, the Docker file, the Docker Compose file, can contain an enormous amount of information about what this project needs in a way that's very portable. And you can, even if you're not going to use it in Docker, you can read through that and be like, okay, here's where they're installing, curl, here's where they're installing the MySQL libraries or whatever, and understand what this project needs to run.
That's great. Do you, kind of digging into that example with your rake task there and documenting that for a project you're working on, it's something that I've done over the years where you can go into Rails console or like a Rails app and you're like, well, I want to play with this gem to kind of interact with an API, but I'm not totally sure how their system works because not all documentation on APIs is super intuitive, or sometimes even you want to pull some real data down, from, so you're playing around with it. So I've kind of taken that approach as well, where I might put together a rake task that I can keep rerunning. And like, okay, I get a little further, I'm spitting out some output or something to, in the terminal or whatever. So I'm just so I can kind of play around with it without having to build a whole interface to it or plug in everything behind the scenes and everything. So it's kind of a way to debug or just like maybe even just understand how I might approach interacting with this, this client library and an API or something. Especially if I'm using some sort of open source library where the documentation is not super. It doesn't seem to be applicable to exactly what I'm doing right now, but I want to know, okay, what kind of data might I get back? Or what does that actually look like with this client's data, where rather than some generic stuff that might be in the documentation?
Right. And there are a lot of nice interactive ways to do that kind of research and discovery. But I really like to lean on ways that give me a persistent and shareable and versioned notebook or sandbox, which is what you get when you decide to go ahead and use your project automations to do that and save it there, leave it there. You don't have to take them out once you understand it.
I always think about how when I'm pairing with people and I start doing that, I'm like, well, part of my motivation there is to avoid copy pasting. I'm like, okay, I'm in an editor. I got this, I'm interacting with a client API and I've got these 4 or 5 lines that are doing some stuff. If I'm, one approach might be just copy and paste this up in a Rails console and see what's happening. But then I have to go back and repaste it again every time I want to do it. And you're like, where am I at? Or have I set the variables and that it's depending on? So that can get a little tricky and stuff like that. And you can also use things like, open up a debugger or a pry in the middle of that and interact with it as well, which is pretty awesome.
Anything that you can turn into a REPL, like any process that you can turn into a REPL, I think it becomes more tractable.
I hadn't thought about keeping that stuff around for a long time, though.
I mean, I think at some point you need to figure out how you're going to organize it in a way that says, okay, this stuff over here is research and this stuff over here we actually expect to run. But yeah, I don't have a huge problem with having your research versioned somewhere that you can find it and actually try and run it.
That makes sense. Do you use the metaphor technical debt much?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's still a useful metaphor. I think it has its limitations, but it is a useful metaphor.
How do you define that or talk about it with people that you're collaborating with? Do you find that people share the same understanding of what technical debt is, or do you feel like it's drastically different in every team that you've been a part of?
I think most teams I've interacted with have a roughly similar idea of technical debt. Their management doesn't always have the same idea that they do, but I think most developers seem to understand that it refers to friction. It refers to the parts that constantly give you friction. Some people take the metaphor really seriously in terms of we are choosing to go into debt here. Some take it less seriously, just using it as a general term for these are the areas of friction in our code base.
How do you go about like organizing technical debt type tasks versus like say new feature bug fixes? Do you feel like there's been a common thread that you've seen has worked well in teams where they can properly identify it, prioritize it, and then potentially even sell the like say the business people, I'm air quoting that, the product owners or whoever's making the decisions about what priorities look like, to kind of advocate for improving some of that or reducing friction?
Well, I think it's really important to have some data collection on like, your churn, your like this, which parts of the code base are the sources of defects and which parts of the code base are where it gets changed the most, and where do those sections collide. If you have some data over where the most of your churn is, you can say, okay, we'd really like to spend some time cleaning this up. But I mean, most of the time that's really more of an organizational issue. A lot of times it's organizational debt as opposed to technical debt, because it's really about, where you find this stuff is where people's understandings need to come together. It's in the code where a bunch of people's understandings need to come together. And sometimes that's artificially put together. That's an area that might have been artificially dried up, and maybe two people, it could be separated out, and you could allow a little bit of, dare I say, dampness, and allow things to proceed, two different things to proceed their own ways, because they're really different. They might be sort of different facets on the same domain understanding, but they are different, coming from different angles. Something that has really changed how I think about technical debt, though, is I think there's been an understanding for a long time that we deliver features. Business comes up with features that they would like, and we deliver those features, but then along the way, sometimes we accidentally deliver some technical debt too. Or maybe deliberately, if we're just deliberately going fast. I don't know. And the way that my mental model has just completely changed is I don't really believe that we deliver features anymore. I don't think that that's a useful model of what we do. What we do is we carry capabilities, or we support capabilities, whichever word you prefer. And I think of this mentally. I think of this as a computer role-playing game where you have an inventory. Maybe one of those games that has like the grid inventory where you have to kind of slot things into the grid, and eventually you run out of space. It's not like you can make a feature take up zero space. We like to believe that there is such a thing as done for a feature, and that if we could just do this right, we could figure out how to deliver features and have them be done. And I think that we've given ourselves an enormous amount of institutional guilt over the fact that we can't seem to deliver features and have them stay done. And I say guilt because I see this in so much software writing, this sort of idea lurking in the room that what we're striving for, the ideal that we're striving for, is that we could deliver a feature and have it be done and stay done. And not have to revisit it constantly, whether because of bugs or because of misunderstandings. And that's not what we do. What we do is we support people, we support capabilities that hopefully people want. And that is always, every capability is always going to add to our inventory until it's gone, until it's dead, until it's out of the code base. And we can defrag that. We can do things that enable us to sort of move those into smaller slots in our inventory and slot them, a bunch of things together so that they really take up a smaller space in our shared mental inventory, in our inventory of maintenance. And that's totally possible. And that's, I think, what we're doing a lot of the times when we talk about refactoring, we talk about refurbishment, we talk about redesign. That's what we're doing, is we are we're smoothing off some of those rough edges and allowing things in our inventory to take up a smaller amount of space. But ultimately, there is a limit to how much a team, a semathecy, a system of people, a socio-technical system of people and software can support. And I think that it's important, so that's like the thing that's really changed my thinking the most, is we need to reflect that to the business, that like this isn't like it's not reasonable to expect that at some point the feature will be done and it won't take up any space for us anymore.
You're going to have to maintain it, right? And continue iterating on it.
The world is going to move out from under us. The services we depend on are going to move out from under us. The software, the libraries we use are going to version out from under us. And our customers are going to move out from under us in what they expect from us. So no, it's, until it's gone, it's always going to be part of the capability that we carry.
So another thing I was looking forward to speaking with you was related to DevOps. And so in preparing for this conversation, you conveyed that DevOps is a philosophy, not a role, which perked my ears up because I'm labeling tickets in our ticketing system like, oh, this is something for the DevOps person to work on. What do you mean by this?
Okay. All right. So I should probably preface this with the statement that I am definitely not a DevOps expert. There are some folks out there. I'm not one of them. I was kind of late to boning up on all this stuff, and I've been doing my best to read up on some of the kind of formative texts of this discipline and what it's all about. And it was hard for me at first. And I want to say this because I suspect I'm not the only one. It was hard for me at first because it's not like a technology. It's not even a management style exactly, like, matrix management or something. But I did read some of the sort of founding documents. I read the Phoenix Project. Recently I read Team Topologies, which is a nice little book that kind of slots into that world of literature. And I've started to, listen to more people in that field. And I mean, my biggest takeaway is that it's about stream alignment, buzzword. It's about, like we were saying, you're here to support capabilities. You're not here to churn out widgets. We are here as a software organization, as a socio-technical system to support certain capabilities. Somebody can type in an address and get a map to that address or something. That is a capability that you add to somebody's life. And as an organization, we support that, from the perspective of people writing software that does that routing, and people working on systems that host the software, and people who respond to support requests and all kinds of things. The message of like the Phoenix Project and related work was, it works better when we all work together, when we're not throwing stuff over the wall at each other to say, okay, I am done with this feature. Now I'm going to hurl it over the wall at ops, and they are going to put it into production. It works a lot better when everybody's working on that together. They're not treating it as, basically a waterfall process. My understanding is that it's a philosophy of, let's blur those lines more. Let's, as developers, we should also be writing the automations that perform our continuous delivery. And we should be maintaining the automations that perform our continuous delivery and be responsible for them. If our capabilities aren't getting to the end user, we're not done. So, when you listen to the people that kind of coined the term DevOps, they are talking about bringing those skills into your development organization. They're talking about being able to be responsible for your whole continuous delivery pipeline. And yet what I have seen in what people talk about, how people use the term, and in consulting, I've seen people talk about it like it's a role, like it's the ops role, which is exactly what we were trying to get away from, is having this completely divided off ops role. And, in team topologies, what they say is that it's totally fine to have a team whose job is to be very good at this stuff and to go around from software team to software team in your organization, helping them level up, helping them get to the point where they can be responsible for their own delivery pipeline. And, spending 6 weeks doing that and then moving on. Like that is the DevOps quote role that makes sense. But if you're throwing stuff over a wall to your DevOps person in order to get it into production, that's not DevOps. That's ops.
Inside my head, I'm thinking through a couple different thought patterns here. One, I'm like, I understand it kind of feels like a role in some ways, because there's there's going to be some certain people that are way more skilled at this because they know the infrastructure and they understand, like, if you're pushing things out and automating delivery through some cloud platform, AWS cloud, Google cloud, whatever, right? And then there's like domain knowledge you got to learn around all that and keep up with all the tooling there, while you're trying to keep up with the tooling of the programming language or the framework or whatever you're using yourselves, or the multiple frameworks you're using just to put out like a new feature capability. Like, oh, we got to add a couple new form fields to this form, this website and this one thing, and then have some reporting get updated as a result of that. Oh, I also need to understand the whole pipeline and how this all gets connected together. And wondering, the thing that I keep coming back to in my head is just like, it feels like there's a lot of prerequisites getting involved in the process. But maybe I'm thinking too granular to the individual, and maybe it's just like understanding that there's a team dynamic. But how do you not end up with some sort of specialization in the same that you would be with, like, certain people might have a lot more experience refactoring or system, architecting everything, and they can't be part of every single conversation. And the junior developer on the team that joins is like, cool, I've been doing this for 9 months now, and wait, what am I doing with Docker and all this, stuff? Like, where is that? And or is this something that DevOps, is this something that really larger organizations could fully support, or as a small scrappy team, maybe you're going to be a little bit more specialized?
I honestly think in the small scrappy teams is where you most need to absorb the DevOps mindset, the philosophy of, we are responsible for this. This is our thing. It's our pipeline. We're delivering this straight to the customer. And if there's someone in there who's like a bottleneck and an opaque black box to our delivery, that's not going to support our process very well. Like I said, in larger organizations, you do see. I think they call it an enablement team, which is the team of people who are really pros at the delivery side and the CI side, and they're going around. They're spending some time embedded with teams to kind of get to work with them to build out an integration and delivery infrastructure and build out that understanding with them, so that they feel like they have some confidence around their particular integration and delivery setup. And you also see, in larger organizations, you see a team who's responsible for basically coming up with best practices and moving us all over, we're gonna get an account with Circle CI, and we're going to spin that up, and we're going to figure out how to use it well in our organization, and then we're going to promulgate those practices, maybe come up with some boilerplate for projects that we recommend you all use. I'm not a big fan of requiring everyone to use the same process, because that kind of goes against team autonomy, but you can have teams who are responsible for this is how we do things. Unless you have a really good reason, a better idea, and a good reason for it, this is how we do things here, crib off of these practices. So I think that does make sense. But I think that we should really, the DevOps idea is that we should constantly be pushing back on the impulse to specialize, to hyper-specialize, and make delivery somebody else's problem. I should probably spell out the problems I've seen with this. And the biggest problem I've seen is just people being blocked on continuous integration issues and delivery issues that they are not empowered to fix. Sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days, because it's somebody else's problem. And I think that's just so it takes away so much from this wonderful world that we have now of being able to do continuous delivery, and being able to do very fast incremental agile development, that if we can avoid that, then we should.
We'll be back with our interview with Avdi in just a moment. Hi, it's me, Robby. I just wanted to take a quick moment to say thank you for making time to listen to the Maintainable Software podcast. If you're finding these conversations valuable, please consider walking out into the street with a big piece of chalk and writing on the sidewalk, Maintainable.fm is one of my top 20 technical podcasts about software development. #Maintainable software. #best practices. Or you could just write a review on Apple Podcasts to help spread the word. With that, let's get back to our interview with Avdi and Grimm. Have you seen any teams or been part of a team that you feel like have been really effective at keeping their dependencies or their frameworks, say Rails or whatever they're using, keeping those core libraries and frameworks up to date while shipping new capabilities? Or has that always been we should probably get around to that at some point, and it gets kicked down the curb a year, 5 years?
The last group that I did a fair amount of consulting for did a pretty good job of that. They had some people that were just felt very motivated to keep things up to date and just do the legwork. Sometimes it takes having somebody who's empowered, like a staff engineer level person who can choose to not work on tickets and choose to just work on going through a code base, doing all the annoying fiddly bits to get it running on the next version of Rails or the next JavaScript framework version or whatever. So I think that's a pattern that seems to help, is having that person.
Have you seen it been very effective, where those people have been able to help spread that skill set or confidence or comfort? Because I'm sure you've been in this scenario where, like, okay, we're going to create a branch. We're going to start going down the path of working on upgrade. You get a couple days into it. You're like, okay, this is opening up a bunch of rabbit holes and things. Yeah. This is going to be bigger. I'll come back to this. I got to jump over to something else. A couple weeks go by. You dig a little bit. Where was I? And then it keeps, you've got those branches. Like every project I feel like I ever see has some branch up on GitHub or Bitbucket or whatever that's like an attempted upgrade that hasn't been touched in like a year. And you're like, oh yeah, we tried, but kind of hit a wall and didn't know where to proceed. And the world has shifted since then. As you said earlier, like all this stuff is going to change out from underneath you unless you stick around and just stay where you're at, which isn't great either.
Yeah, I mean that group that I'm thinking of, they actually had this changed my thinking a little bit. They had a pretty strong policy of, we don't lock things down version wise if we can avoid it, and we use like Dependabot to just constantly accept updates and review updates, and that's like part of everyone's job is to look at those Dependabot tickets, and if there's no red flags, then go ahead and approve it. I mean, I think you kind of have to accept a culture of it's better to break things by upgrading than it is to allow them to fall behind. Fail forward is the way I think of that, or fall forward is, and maybe you'll have to fix something that broke because you updated.
That always comes back to touching on what is the alternative there? Is it that I would imagine there's a lot of people like, well, I don't feel confident enough in our tests that's going to catch something, right? And so it's like, if you don't feel confident there, when will you ever? And then so there's always like this little void of like, well, we'll get some more time to backfill some of the missing tests at some point so we feel more confident, but then that may or may not ever happen. And so then the upgrade for a library or whatever doesn't happen. Becomes this kind of like chicken egg problem where, as you're saying, just take the leap and push the upgrade.
So my opinion on that is your tests are never going to save you there. They're just not. That's not what they're there for. Tests in general, I mean, my opinion after, lo these odd 20 years or whatever, is that I still love tests. I still love testing. I still love test-first development where appropriate. But people are way too clingy about their tests. I think people need to be way more cavalier about throwing tests away. If the test is in your way, get rid of it. Because for me, part of that, I can say that partly because for me a big because I do a lot of tests first, a big advantage is the design aspect. Like the test helps me design it, and then after that, okay, it's already done a good job. So anything after that, any regression testing it does is gravy. But your tests aren't going to save you from upgrade problems, because the new library version is going to find some way of breaking your software that has nothing, that you never thought to test, even if you're very diligent about it. And that's not what the tests are there for anyway. They're there for your own logic. The thing that tells you if things are broken is production. Ultimately, that is the truth. That is the ground level of truth is it working for people in production or not? And there are so many things that the tests won't catch. So for me, it's about having tests that are close, or even better are in production. I'm a really big fan of, like, if you don't have enough people to exercise your software, then have something that acts like people out there that's testing production just constantly, or periodically anyway, that just puts it through its paces. That'll tell you a lot. And also have, rather than leaning on your testing, rather than putting that effort and time into your tests, into your like tests that run before deployment, put that time into your monitoring, into your statistics gathering and your tracing and your observability. Put that, make sure, get yourself a honeycomb account if you don't have one already. Get that observability in there and start figuring out how to use it. Because ultimately that's, I think, way more valuable for this kind of thing than your test suite.
I think that's some really good recommendations there for the audience to kind of think through and listen. I'm going to have to do a little bit of soul searching there myself, because I think that ends up being one of my hurdles too, is being like, well, I think I've been hit on the, my wrist has been slapped a few too many times in the past for shipping out things like, oh, sorry, I didn't know that was going to break something, because clients and customers can get a little upset at times, right? When there's and then you worry about like, oh, that one client is like, can't let that happen again, right? Like you messed up our invoicing and you're like, wow, we can't just sit here forever. But now we fixed it. Maybe it's a couple hours of inconvenience to deal with that, but then you're not worrying about like being further and further behind on some dependency library or something like that. Or the other option being remove dependencies is another tactic to some people, or seem to be talking more about like, do we need so many dependencies in our systems? Say, when I say dependencies for our audience, I'm talking about like open source libraries that were conveniently popping into our gem file and being like, great, we've got all this extra capabilities that we didn't even know we needed.
Well, and also like to jump back to something I said earlier with the idea of observability, and part of your observability is your relationship with support. Even if you don't have like super built out observability instrumentation, if you're working on a project that has a support staff, having a really good relationship with them and talking to them constantly can be so valuable in understanding what's actually going on with your software. Also, what people are actually using, which is a big deal too. But yeah, seeing what's actually going on with it is huge. And also, working closely with your support staff can give you ideas about amelioration. I think about that a lot. Like, do we focus on avoiding bugs, avoiding failures, or do we focus on amelioration? There's another word that's easier to say, but I can't think of it right now. And that kind of comes out of like the resilience discipline. Like the organizations that focus the most on getting it right and on correctness are the ones that fail the hardest. Whereas the organizations that are a little bit on their toes because they're handling surprises, that's where the resilience comes from, is how do we handle surprises? And like that can be as simple as letting support know when something might be hinky. Listen and hearing from them, and then being like, okay, we need to communicate to our customers about this. We need to get out ahead of it, communicate to our customers about it. Way too many organizations handle this stuff by feeling so ashamed that they broke something that they go dark and trying to fix it. And that's where like apologizing as fast as you can probably buy you a lot more than a more comprehensive test suite.
I like that, thinking about how teams are just focusing on how are we going to be reactive, but how do we handle surprises? One of my team's like approaches and things we commit to our clients is like no surprises, which now I'm starting to have second guess that a little bit, being like, no, we might surprise you, but we'll be there to help support it immediately to address the problem, and we'll all be better off for having gone through that process. But you can't guarantee no failure, right? And you can't be. There's also like that interesting thing. It was like, you feel like there's a spectrum of being really cautious about what you're shipping versus, there might be, we've heard of, move quick and break things. And that can be taken in a lot of different ways. And you can just be super rogue and not really invest in stability, maybe in some ways too. Definitely seen a lot of peculiar code bases where like, we're not worried about that stuff because we're just shipping it. So where's that extreme, finding that healthy balance in there of reproducible tests? Because someone might argue like, don't worry about it until it's a problem. How do you help a team understand what the definition of done is, and there's that spectrum there?
Right. Yeah. Of course, as you know now, I don't believe in done.
Nothing is ever complete.
Nothing's ever done. Yeah. This is making me think a little bit. I was typing a little bit on the mic, but I had to look up. There's this wonderful book, The Field Guide to Understanding Human Error by Sidney Dekker. Have you ever heard of him?
No, I'm not.
He gets cited a lot in the resilience community. He's an expert in like industrial disasters, planes crashing, factories blowing up, that kind of thing. And he's put a lot of research into which organizations handle this well and which don't handle it as well. And that's, one of the things he talks about is if you've got an organization with no surprises, like, the organization that's proudly has their number of, days, 600 days since the last incident, that's the organization that's going to fall the hardest. If you have an organization that's constantly dealing with incidents, as counterintuitive as it is, that's an organization that knows how to deal with incidents rather than sweep them under the rug.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm going to have to look up that book, and I'll include links to that for the audience in the show notes as well. I want to take this moment to make sure we get a chance to kind of pivot and talk about graceful.dev. So for those in the audience who might not be familiar with it, can you provide a little bit of a high-level introduction to it?
Yeah, sure. So graceful.dev is my kind of grand unified site of developer training and education resources. I have a number of courses there, and you can either get an individual course or you can sign up for a membership. And basically, it is an outgrowth of something that I did for many years called Ruby Tapas, which was a screencast show, and still is, a screencast show of short-focused, Ruby-centric, not always Ruby, screencasts. I've racked up 650-odd episodes at this point. And anyway, I kind of got to the point where I'd been wanting for a long time to kind of rebrand in a way that reflects that I don't just talk about Ruby. I talk about a lot of other things, including a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about today. So yeah, Graceful Dev is sort of the next chapter of Ruby Tapas, plus my other courses are kind of rolled into that.
Nice. I saw there was some content that wasn't by you on there as well. I believe maybe from some of the people over at Honeycomb as an example. So
yes,
there's some free content that people can go watch as well and get a feel for the type of things and topics you're digging into.
Yeah. Particularly my partner Jessica Kerr has been working on a course on observability using Honeycomb. She works at Honeycomb now, and that's kind of a joint project between Honeycomb and Graceful Dev.
Excellent. We had trying to remember what episode Jessica was on, but she was on Maintainable a while back as well. Really enjoyed that conversation. Earlier we were talking about technical debt and teams that are needing to advocate to, say, I'm air quoting again, like the people that are deciding what the priorities are. Let's say there's some people that have been a part of a team for a couple of years. They feel like they've brought up, hey, we feel like we need to deal with some areas of friction, technical debt, however they're referring to that. But they've heard not right now, maybe a few too many times. And so they're starting to translate to their head like, oh, it's not worth even asking about because they're just going to get a no. They said no. So I guess they don't care about that now. What advice could you offer them on, outside of, say, seeking out a new job? Would you advise them to kind of navigate that to maybe take some corrective action today?
Something to think about as an individual contributor is that giving folks the benefit of the doubt, it is possible that folks perceive that when you have tried to address areas that bother you before, you've gone down a rabbit hole and not come up until 6 weeks later. I say this as someone who is extremely prone to that sort of thing. Looking back over the course of my career, I can definitely see that I'm the sort of person who will dive down a rabbit hole, hyper focus on something, and often they turn out to be larger than I'm biting off something bigger than I realized. So it is worth considering that maybe people are saying that for that reason. Maybe they aren't just against quality. The only thing that I can think of that's actionable there is getting better at breaking it down into smaller pieces, breaking down that technical debt, whatever you call it, technical risk, that's another good term, technical risk, into, getting good at breaking it down into smaller pieces, biting off smaller pieces than you previously believed was possible. I mean, that's a whole area too. I would be remiss in this particular conversation not to bring up Michael Feather's book, Working Effectively with Legacy Code. I think that book is perennially important for this kind of work.
That's some good, thoughtful advice there, and appreciate you kind of reflecting on your own some of your own rabbit holes you might have gone down over the past. I definitely have been prone to that, but I've also worked with a number of people like that over the years, and it's been interesting when they would advocate for wanting to do something. After having gone through that experience of, say, managing someone, then I was like, well, you decided on a Friday that you wanted to rewrite this whole library for something we needed to ship early next week, and now it's like the end of the week, and it's hard to explain to the client or whoever that, sorry, this is getting delayed because so-and-so decided to rewrite something on their own. And that's not like necessarily a bad thing, but we're kind of in this weird situation. And so if you bring it up, like maybe in a retrospective or whatever, your team's like, all right, what worked well. And that gets brought up. And then starts to build this like interesting assumptions that, we're gonna be in that pickle again, and I don't want to have that awkward conversation again with the client or whoever is paying the bills. And meanwhile, I don't also want to keep someone from trying to be an advocate for, as you said, quality and long-term maintainability of the software. It's an interesting dance between lots of different interests, I suppose.
Yeah, it is. And, sometimes we just want to do a thing because we have a picture in our heads of how it could be much more elegant than it is. I certainly often, have that. And sometimes that doesn't actually, isn't reflected in any kind of gain for the business. It really depends on how, like, central the code is, too. Is this, right in, like, the main line of what we're constantly working on and fighting with, or is it off in the corner somewhere?
Hi there. Do you know someone who might be looking for assistance with their Ruby on Rails application? Planet Argon would love to meet them. We're offering a $1,000 referral bonus. Send someone our way, and if they sign up for services with Planet Argon, we'll give them a $1,000 discount. And in return, you'll get a check for $1,000 in the mail, just for knowing the right person. Hop on over to planetargon.com/referrals for more information and to refer someone our way. That's planetargon.com/referrals. Thanks.
A couple of quick last questions for you, Avdi. I know you mentioned a couple of books already, but is there a non-software, non-technical book that you find yourself recommending to peers on a regular basis?
I don't know if there's one that I find myself recommending to peers on a regular basis. I am a fan of so many books that narrowing it down is hard, but I'll tell you one that's given me a bunch of inspiration in the past year or two, and it's I think it's called The Secret Life of Trees. Or maybe it's The Hidden Life of Trees. It's one of those two. And it's about trees. And it's given me a lot to think about in terms of like how complex systems work, how complex interdependent systems, like software teams, work.
It's interesting. Is that Peter Wohlleben?
Yes, Wohlleben.
Excellent. I'll definitely include links to that in the show notes for everybody. Where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations and opinions about software development online?
Well, you can find me at Avdi, AVDI, on Twitter. You can find my blog at avdi.codes. Lately, I've been writing a lot of stuff about like the business of, quote, a banana stand, of my like graceful dev business of content and courses and stuff like that, and like the nuts and bolts of running a business like that. Graceful Dev, yep, that's the other big place.
Excellent. We'll definitely have those all in the show notes for everybody listening. Well, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, Avdi. Thank you so much for talking shop.
Thank you for having me.
Maintainable.